Australia cannot afford to escalate a military confrontation of any kind. Its behaviour now is really an attempt to reset the rules of international behaviour.
Hi everyone. Today we have a new guest in our show. It's Sam.
Roggeveen.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yes, so today we would have a viewpoint from Australia, which is quite interesting. And could you please introduce yourself a little bit?
Thanks, Richard. Yes, I'm Sam Roggeveen. I work at the Lowy Institute, which is a foreign policy think tank in Sydney, although I'm based in Canberra, the Australian capital, and I'm director of the International Security Program, which means that I oversee a small research program dedicated to Australian defence policy, Australian aspects of Australian foreign policy, but also the region. I have I have a long-standing interest in China's military forces and how they are developing, and also the implications for Australia of the rise of the Chinese People's Liberation Army.
Perfect. Okay, so I would ask you, the first question would be, how compromised is Australia? And I think that the recent trouble that's been already, it lasted for a few years, were the calls for an independent inquiry into the origins of the Wuhan virus in 2020. And my question there is, how come your government was that direct? Like, did it have any secret information? Why was it so confident to challenge China?
I'm not sure it was all that confident. I think maybe that the statement that was made at the time was made hastily and with not too much preparation. And after it was made, the government felt obligated to stand by its position,
Okay.
so that it didn't look like it had acted hastily. But honestly, that incident of itself was just one of a number of things that had annoyed the Chinese. And it began, of course, with the decision by the previous government to ban Huawei from competing for the 5G infrastructure contract. Australia was the first country among Western economies to take that kind of action. Many others have followed. The United Kingdom and the United States have followed since. In fact, Australia was fairly early in alerting other countries to various incidents of Chinese influence and interference in Australian domestic affairs. We had an incident with a politician who we learned had accepted a small sum of money for international travel from a Chinese businessman with links to the Communist Party.
Yeah,
And
but
so that really
yes.
put China onto the front pages here in Australia, and really created a lot of attention on Australia. But on your question of whether Australia is
Yes.
compromised, I really don't think it is at all. I mean, I think our political system and our security structures are very robust. And the security apparatus here in Australia, led by ASIO, which is our roughly equivalent of the FBI, our domestic security agency, it's under unprecedented pressure, it claims, but nevertheless, that agency is very well funded, and Australia is taking a lot of steps, whether it comes to espionage or cyber intrusions, political interference. Australia has taken a number of steps to meet that increased risk, and I think it's something that we're showing that we can cope with.
But isn't it that your government also had reasons to act, decisively, because you've been exposed, to uh, uh, malicious hacks like the Microsoft hack, and I think the Chinese community has also been, forced to help the Chinese government. There was a lot of influence exerted in elections. So I think your government also had reasons to be upset with the Chinese behavior here, right?
Yeah,
I mean, here,
absolutely.
yes.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't fully endorse your description. I mean, I think the Chinese community actually is one of the great assets that we have, that Australia has in our relationship with China, and has been a major contributor to Australia's wealth and its well-being over many decades. Uh, so yes, definitely the behaviour of the Chinese government has been central to all of this, and I have no, um, uh, I have no illusions about that the Chinese side is behaving more aggressively and more assertively, but Australia on the whole has coped very well. And that includes, by the way, the economic coercion measures that China has imposed over the last, let's say, 18 months or so. China has imposed a series of economic measures that have targeted various specific parts of the Australian export economy, including coal, but various sectors of the economy, food and wine exports, for instance, have also been hit with restrictions. But the Lowy Institute actually has done research on this and found that those industries that were hit by Chinese export bans have coped very, very well. They found new markets and they've bounced back. So I think this all goes to show that the Australian economy and our political system is very robust and is quite resilient and can resist this kind of pressure.
Yeah, that's also my impression, that your entrepreneurs and the economy has done quite well. I mean, you withstood it, and I think the economy is doing not so badly. Like, definitely not as bad as the Chinese government maybe hoped.
Right.
I want to ask about specific cases, like, for example, like the Vicky Xu case, the journalist who was harassed and attacked personally and by the Chinese government after her report or exposure of the Uyghurs. So is this like a big story in Australia, or is the government, for example, doing something to protect citizens in the future so it doesn't go that bad?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a big story anymore. It's certainly been there, and it certainly was a big story at the beginning, and it's still there in the background, and you see occasional media reports about it. But no, it is definitely not a big story. Look, I admit I'm not following this issue closely, and I'm not an expert on the topic. But it does create a real barrier to trying to reestablish close relations with China. And I think one of the encouraging things to emerge from the new government in Australia that was elected just about 2 months ago is that the signals they are sending is that the door is open to China. They are prepared to have better relations with China and to have new discussions with China about improving the relationship. But Australia does not need to be in a hurry. Australia does not need to look desperate to re-establish its ties with Beijing. And I think the government has done a very good job of signalling that it is prepared to be patient.
Yeah, it seems to stand quite firm now regarding those four conditions that were served by the Chinese government. I think you're doing a good job. You're saying, yeah, there is no reason to accept it or even discuss it, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think foreign governments often make demands of other countries. So Australia um, uh, once had a human rights dialogue with China where we made demands of the Chinese government that they were never going to meet. So that is, I think it's possible to overplay those demands. It is not unusual diplomatic behaviour. So I wouldn't overstate that, and it's not a complete barrier to the resumption of full diplomatic relations between Australia and China.
But there is also the let's say more military harassment, like of the spy plane recently, or I think there was this ship that was uh, going around Australia, right? Recently, the spy ship. So
Yes.
how does this look like? Is there the reaction also as firm and as solid, or
No, no. Actually, I would argue that it's been less firm, and for very good
yeah,
reason. And the reason is simply that Australia cannot afford to escalate a military confrontation of that kind. So you're discussing, first of all, just about 2.5 months ago, there was a report of an Australian P-8 surveillance aircraft in the South China Sea, which had a confrontation with
Yes.
Chinese fighter aircraft, where the Chinese aircraft behaved very dangerously, and came very close to putting the Australian aircraft in danger, and the crew on board in danger. And then earlier, that also a few months before that, there'd also been an incident of a Chinese destroyer actually using a laser targeting device against
Yes.
another Australian P-8 surveillance aircraft. Again, potentially with dangerous consequences for the crew on board. So those incidents are really concerning, partly because they tend to indicate that China is not prepared to operate by long established rules of behavior that used to govern those kind of incidents. For instance, when it comes to NATO countries. So there are pretty well established rules between NATO and Russia about how these kind of intercepts happen. And we thought also that similar rules applied to confrontations between Western aircraft and Chinese aircraft, or Western ships and Chinese ships. But these incidents suggest that China is prepared to, I guess, nibble away at the edges of those rules and create new rules on the ground. The problem for Australia, of course, is that we're not strong enough to resist that kind of pressure. So, for instance, if Australia was to decide that our surveillance aircraft needed to be escorted by fighter aircraft in the South China Sea, well, that would require a huge military effort. It would mean deploying fighter aircraft forward. It would mean deploying tanker aircraft forward to support the fighters, because they don't have the same kind of range as the surveillance planes do. And then, of course, once you're up there with them, you've got the possibility that you actually have another confrontation with the Chinese Air Force or the Chinese Navy. And what do you do then? If China still insists on behaving the same way, does Australia escalate? I mean, China always has the advantage here because its forces are so much bigger and more capable than ours,
Yes.
that if we choose to escalate, then China will escalate again. And we will always end up on the wrong side of uh, uh, that equation.
Yeah, because it's a pattern not only with regard to Australia, it's the same with Taiwan. It's around the bases in Djibouti. It's also the same day there was a case with a Canadian plane. So it seems like they're just using their yeah quantitative superiority, right?
And
Trying.
this is something we need to get used to, right? This is how great powers behave. Great powers insist that they be the ones, that they have the biggest say in how the rules are made and in what the rules are. So China's behavior now is really an attempt to reset the rules of international behavior.
So you're saying that's the new normal, and we would have to get used to it.
We have to get used to it, but also we need to be very careful about defining the point where we're prepared to say this far and no further. So I think in the South China Sea case, it's actually pretty easy. I mean, nobody in Australia wants to hear this, but nevertheless, I think it's true that the South China Sea is not a vital interest for Australia. It's important,
Okay.
and we would rather that it wasn't dominated by China. But are we prepared for a military confrontation with China to defend, uh, the international rules-based order in the South China Sea? I really don't think we are. I don't think we're prepared to take that risk. So we have to be very careful and very precise about defining our interests and defining the things that we are prepared to fight about and the things that we're not prepared to fight about.
Okay, so then the question is, how much does Taiwan fit into it? Because your former prime minister visited Taiwan. I heard some statements that Taiwan is within the interest of the Australian government, the same as Japan said it. Is it really so, or was it just more a political stunt?
I'm sure that the people who say these things believe them, but I disagree. I disagree. I don't think Taiwan is a vital interest for Australia, particularly when you consider the consequences of a war over Taiwan. So, I mean, if Australia was to get involved in such a war, it would be alongside the United States.
Yes.
And a war between the United States and China over Taiwan there's an excellent chance that such a war would very quickly become a nuclear war. And so we have to be very, very careful and very sober about deciding whether it's in our interest to have a war escalate to such a level. And if it's not, then I think we ought to be much more careful about the kind of rhetorical commitments we make to Taiwan.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one here. I think that Chinese are able to escalate to a nuclear attack with regards to Taiwan, and not only towards Australia, also Japan, maybe even the US. They're really committed.
And I would stress, though, that this is not to say that we ought to abandon Taiwan entirely. But what I would focus on much more, if I was the United States, but also uh, from an Australian perspective, even though we're a marginal player, I would focus much more on arming the Taiwanese themselves. So I would like to see Taiwan spend more on its own defence. It only spends about, I believe, about 2% of its GDP on defence. And I would like to see Taiwan really embrace this so-called porcupine strategy that so many have talked about, which I think is a viable way forward to deter Chinese military power. But the idea that Taiwan's defense can be left entirely in the hands of Western powers, including the United States, I think it's already too late for that. I think Taiwan needs to do more of it itself.
Okay, the last topic I would like to discuss are the Pacific Islands. And how urgent is the situation now? Do you think that China has now a lot of influence there, or how does it look like?
Well, I think perhaps China's influence in the Pacific Islands has been overstated slightly. So we know, in fact, from the Lowy Institute's own research that Chinese aid spending in the Pacific Islands has peaked, probably peaked around 2018, and has now flattened out a little bit. Uh, so. Uh, and also, I think Australia and New Zealand in particular have some really important long term advantages over China in the Pacific Islands region. First and foremost is just physical proximity. So if there's a natural disaster or even a political crisis in the Pacific Islands region, we'll get there before anybody else. Secondly, we have historical and cultural ties, sporting ties with the Pacific Islands region that China cannot match. Thirdly, we have a Pacific Island worker scheme in Australia. New Zealand has a similar arrangement, which again, China will never match that. China will never import Pacific Island workers to China in the way that Australia can. And I think we should be doing more of that to tie our economies together. And then the last thing I would say about China's influence compared to Australia's influence in the region is that there's an imbalance of resolve here. The Pacific Islands just means more to us than it does to China. So we will always fight harder. I think the Pacific Islands will always be a second or third order priority for China. For us, it will always be first order. So we will fight harder for it. Now, China has massive resources, and so it will always have some influence, and it will probably grow. We can't stop that, but I think at the moment, the events of recent months, when we saw the security agreement signed with Solomon Islands, there's been a degree of panic in Australia about China's presence in the Pacific Islands, and we certainly need to work harder, but it's too soon to panic.
Yeah, but if that's the case, as you just described it, then how come China has now so much influence? I mean, they seem to be doing quite well and having a understanding with the elites there. So it seems like they are having their way.
Well, to a degree. I mean, certainly they're very wealthy. China has a lot of resources, and that goes a long way. But you know, it takes more than money, and it certainly even takes more than elite capture to really develop deep influence in these countries. I mean, Australia and New Zealand have been doing this for decades now, and it's always proven very difficult. These are sovereign nations. They have their own stubborn leaders and stubborn problems to deal with, and very difficult for any foreign power to have a high degree of influence. So, my guess is that China still has a lot to learn about the Pacific Islands region.
Yeah, but that's very interesting because when I read, what's in the mainstream media and the coming security-related cooperation of those islands and China, it seems to be expanding and developing quite well. But you're saying it's actually a bit overstated, and your connections with them are still much stronger than China's.
Yeah, it is definitely still expanding, but the imbalance is there also. So, for instance, you may get the impression from the media coverage that China is
Yes.
now the dominant aid partner to the Pacific Islands, but that's not true at all. Australia is far and away the biggest aid donor to the Pacific Islands region by a large margin. So, China still has an awful lot of catching up to do.
Yeah, and also when their foreign minister was there recently in May, he didn't have such as warm welcome as I think he hoped for.
Right.
So actually, he got some pushback. So in a way, yeah, it's not as bad as the media says. I think there is still some chance.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the interview. It was really interesting. You're my first guest from Australia, and I wanted very much to have someone to tell us a little bit about the point of view from Australia.
Ah, thank you. Well, I'm thrilled. I'm glad to help you, Richard.
Thank you very much.